That was a great talk. Yeah, so I think I'm actually more nervous about giving Christian's intro than I am about giving my own talk, just because I don't know that I'll be able to do justice to the character and quality of research that I see in Christian. He and I started graduate school together in 2018. He hails from Rock Hill, South Carolina. And he went to Yale for undergrad, studying mechanical engineering, and then on arrival at Berkeley, jumped straight into the microbiology, deep end of the pool in the Alvarez-Cohen group. Since arriving at Berkeley, I need a list of his achievements here. Since arriving at Berkeley, he has been the recipient of the Ford Fellowship, the HDR Water Scholarship, DOE's SCSGR Fellowship. He's also an IT research consultant for the Berkeley High Performance Computing Cluster. I found that out through Google. He's also super passionate, and I know it's deeply felt in his heart, advancing education for communities of color, STEM education for communities of color. He's also the president of BGIS. And on top of all that, he's actually done a PhD here, and a really, really cool one on Anammox bacteria. And yeah, so after that, he's going to be heading to Argonne National Labs for a postdoctoral fellowship, which is pretty cool. But like on all that aside, I think the things that I'm most impressed about Christian is just like how he handles all of these things in stride. And I first noticed this about him in our master's year. You know, like a water chemistry test was the next day, and I'm like sweating bullets, like not getting sleep, and he's just like cool as a cucumber. And I think this has kind of like allowed him to take on all these things and handle it all in stride and do way more than the things that I just kind of listed off. But the other cool thing is like, yeah, he's like very mellow in all this, but like the man does not mince words if he has a feeling about something. And as someone who cares way too much about what people think of me, I like really, really admire this quality in Christian. So yeah, I'm super honored to be able to introduce Christian, and yeah, take it away.
Appreciate you, my guy. I appreciate it. All right, I don't got much time, so I'm going to get right into it. Title of my talk today is Anammox, Nitrogen, and Empire. So before we get started, I want to do a quick land acknowledgement. It is important to remember that UC Berkeley sits on unceded Ohlone territory that is called Huchun. This is the sovereign territory of the Chochenyo Mukwekwa Ohlone. It's very important to remember that the only reason that we are here is because we're on stolen land. Okay, so before we talk about Anammox, we got to talk a little bit about nitrogen. So nitrogen makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere and 3% of the human body by weight. Now, most of this nitrogen is in the form of amino acids that make up the proteins in our body. And most of the nitrogen in amino acids is in the form of ammonia, which is what we call fixed or reactive, which contrasts to dinitrogen that is completely inert or unreactive. Now, because we can't utilize dinitrogen, we have to take in a source of fixed nitrogen, and we do this by eating food, which contains proteins that our body can break down and recycle the nitrogen. But we're constantly excreting this nitrogen through our urine and our feces, and that goes down the sewers and ends up in the wastewater treatment plants. And because we're constantly excreting nitrogen, we have to take in a source of fixed nitrogen in order to maintain the nitrogen content of our bodies. So what happens to this nitrogen once it gets to the wastewater treatment plants? Unfortunately, most of it is not removed, and it ends up getting discharged into surface waters. When that happens, that causes eutrophication. And this is what happens when algae, which are often limited in growth by nitrogen, are exposed to a nitrogen source and then they proliferate. And this is especially a problem in coastal areas like the Bay. Once they grow and then they die, aerobic bacteria degrade their biomass, which rapidly depletes the oxygen content of the water, creating anoxic zones. And with no oxygen, marine life can't survive. And so we get huge fish kill-offs like what you see here. But these blooms don't just kill fish, they produce neurotoxins, some of which have the potency of cobra venom. There's visual degradation of the water, there's odors, and there's lots of other ecological issues that we've yet to really fully understand. So this is the problem, right? We got to have a solution. That's where Anammox comes in. Anammox, or anaerobic ammonium oxidation, is a biogeochemical process that is facilitated by bacteria that are classified as plankton mycetes. These bacteria literally eat ammonia, oxidizing it to dinitrogen gas. Discovered in 1995, environmental engineers and microbiologists alike have endeavored to study their metabolism and their physiology to build treatment systems that can remove nitrogen from wastewater. Now, these systems have a lower carbon and energy footprint and are highly efficient at removing nitrogen from wastewater, especially in side streams. So this is where I came in. I was a young, eager graduate student, really excited to build better reactors, make more efficient nitrogen removal systems. But after a while, I really became less interested in that. And I really started to get more interested in all the things that the Anammox could do naturally and how they interact with other microbes. The Anammox can produce hydrazine as a byproduct of their reaction. Hydrazine is literally rocket fuel. They can perform extracellular electron transfer on manganese and iron minerals, literally generating electricity. And they can produce laterine lipids, which is a special type of lipid that no other living organism can produce. So I started to ask myself, if the Anammox can do all of this amazing biochemistry, things that we've never seen in nature, things that we still don't fully understand, why do we only care about them in the context of wastewater treatment? And it's this question that I want to spend the rest of my time today trying to answer. So to answer that, we got to dig a little bit deeper into the nitrogen cycle. So dinitrogen, like I said before, is completely unreactive and inert. So in order to get it into a reactive state, it has to undergo what we call fixation. And this converts it into ammonia. Ammonia is converted to nitrate through nitrification, and nitrate is converted back to dinitrogen through denitrification or through Anammox via nitrite. Now, once it is converted back to dinitrogen, it essentially exits the pool of reactive nitrogen. And we think about this as a nitrogen sink, right? So we refer to denitrification and Anammox as nitrogen sinks, and we refer to fixation as a nitrogen input. Now, prior to human activity, these cycles were mostly self-regulated, meaning that the inputs and the sinks were roughly equal. Now let's take a look at what this cycle looks like with human activity. So these numbers are slightly outdated, but do a pretty good job of illustrating my point. Natural nitrogen fixation to terrestrial environments adds about 7.9 teragrams of nitrogen per year. Denitrification removes about 7.1. Now for oceans, it's about 10 teragrams of natural nitrogen fixation, and denitrification removes about 17. And there's also 5 teragrams that's exported from terrestrial environments to the ocean. So that's natural nitrogen fixation. What about anthropogenic activity? 10 teragrams per year is added through Haber-Bosch. Now, Haber-Bosch is an industrial process that generates ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen feedstocks. And this is what allows us to grow all the food to sustain the world's population. And we're going to come back to this later on. Another 3.3 teragrams is added through agriculturally related nitrogen fixation. Another 2 teragrams is added through fossil fuel combustion. Now, if you do a little bit of math here, the natural nitrogen fixation adds about 17 teragrams of nitrogen per year. Anthropogenic activity adds about 15. That means that we've almost matched the natural inputs of nitrogen fixation into the environment, essentially doubling the inputs of reactive nitrogen. So let's think about how this has occurred over different timescales. So human effects on the nitrogen cycle started in earnest back in the 1850s. That's when commercial fertilizers became available. By 1970, we had essentially matched the inputs of nitrogen to terrestrial environments. And by the time this study was published in 2013, we were well on our way to matching the inputs to terrestrial and marine environments. So I want you to think about how dramatic this is that we did this in 150 years. I'm going to show you the Earth's history in terms of geological time. Earth is 4.3 billion years old. Life first emerged 3.6 billion years ago. Hard-body animals 500 million years ago. The dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Pretty close to us in terms of geological time. So phylogenetic reconstructions estimate that nitrogen fixation has been around for about 3.2 billion years. Isotopic evidence suggests that nitrification and denitrification have been around for 2.5 billion years. If you have nitrification, denitrification, and fixation, you have the rough contours of a nitrogen cycle. So that means that the nitrogen cycle has been around for 2.5 billion years, okay? Humans have been around for 100,000 years. So I want you to think about for a second that a complex biogeochemical cycle that took billions of years to develop, billions of years of self-regulation, humans disrupted in 150 years. In order to frame that in a time scale that makes sense for humans, imagine the 2.5 billion year history of the nitrogen cycle was one day. This 150 years will be 4 milliseconds. That means that we have essentially disrupted an entire biogeochemical cycle in the literal blink of an eye in terms of geological time. Now, a lot of people would say that this is a sign of the Anthropocene, right? That we're in a new geological era that is characterized distinctly by human activity. And we're going to come back to this later on. But what I want you to realize now is that this is not random. This did not occur by chance. There were a bunch of events that got us up to this point. And so I want to talk a little bit more about some of those events. So I'm going to take us back to 1444. This is the year of the first documents its slaving voyage by a European power. Portugal, under the reign of King John I, sends an expedition into what is now Sierra Leone and brings back about 300 to 400 enslaved Africans to be sold in Lisbon. Now, the only reason that we know about this expedition is from the works of the royal chronicler, Gomes Yenes de Ajudada, whose account, published in 1450, describes the Africans that were brought back, reading, and I quote, "In these placed all together in that field were a marvelous sight, for amongst them were some white enough, fair to look upon, and well proportioned. Others were less white, like mulattoes. Others again were as black as Ethiops, and so ugly both in features and in body." Now, what is important about this moment from a historical standpoint is not the emergence of racism or slavery. We know through the works of the late great scholar Cedric Robinson that race as a construct emerged simultaneously with the beginnings of capitalism in medieval Europe, and slavery is as old as human history. But what is important about this moment is a convergence of slaveness with blackness, meaning that Africans, because of their biological predisposition, are pathologized to be slaves. G. Ajudada's writings were disseminated all over Europe. And so for a lot of Europeans, this formed the basis of their understandings of Africans. And this helped to cultivate the concept of slave being coterminous with black. And later on set the stage for the emergence of whiteness, as well as transfiguring black bodies in the units of labor. Now I'm going to fast forward to 1690. This is the year that John Locke publishes his seminal work, A Second Treatise on Government. And from this work emerges the infamous labor theory of property. And this theory reads, "Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property." What this means is that property, in the words of the great legal scholar Cheryl Harris, as the right to exclude, is formed from the input of labor, meaning that if you take a piece of land and you work on it, then you make it your private property. Now, this is important because the concept of private property goes hand in hand with the dispossession of indigenous land. Since the quote unquote discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492, the unifying European agenda was to seize and expropriate indigenous lands. And at first, this was pursued through racialized rationalizations of the indigenous as subhuman, right? But once Enlightenment ideas started to take hold, Europeans used the labor theory of property in order to remove the indigenous and claim the land for themselves. Now, indigenous land dispossession has two primary implications. One is genocide. Two is the privatization of land and the transfiguration of land into a basis for production. Europeans thought of humans as being inherently separate from the land, which contrasted with indigenous worldviews of the land that looked at the land through the lens of relationality, meaning that humans and the land are in a symbiotic relationship with each other. Europeans looked as if it was totally backwards. They didn't get it at all. They thought that indigenous land stewardship practices were dumb. They thought that the indigenous were not working the land, and therefore they had no property rights to it. And so it was okay to remove them and claim the land for itself. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why am I talking about slavery and colonialism and to talk about nitrogen? So let me try and explain a little bit. In pre-capitalist agricultural societies, the goal was subsistence. Of course, there are some societies like the Romans and the Greeks that practice cash crop agriculture, but for the most part, people grew what they needed to feed, clothe, and house themselves. In agriculture, the limiting nutrient is nitrogen. If you want to grow enough food so that you don't starve, you have to get enough nitrogen to put into the soil. Pre-capitalist societies did this through traditional soil fertility practices, even though they didn't know what nitrogen was. They did things like crop rotations, incorporating leguminous crops that can naturally fix nitrogen, crop residue recycling, and manuring. This all changed with the emergence of capitalism. With capitalism, everything became contingent around access to land. Land was the basis for all production. If you have land, not only can you grow the things you need to survive, you can grow things to sell on a market. This is contingent on access to labor and raw materials. If you have land, labor, and raw materials, you can produce a commodity to sell on a market. Now, the key here, though, is that the raw materials and the land is privately owned. This is where the concept of private property comes in. You can't sell a commodity if you don't own the means to produce that commodity. Colonialism enables this system because it gives access to the land through the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and the labor comes from slavery. So now, instead of trying to get enough nitrogen to put into the soil for subsistence, we're trying to get enough nitrogen to put into the soil to produce commodities. The more nitrogen, the more commodities, the more the profit. So early forms of capitalism took on the form of what's called mercantile capitalism, or as historian Sven Becker would say, war capitalism, or as Marx would say, primitive accumulation. And this really set the stage for the entire reconstitution of biogeochemical cycles for profit. And initially, it was centered around sugar production in the Caribbean. And it was facilitated through indigenous genocide and mass enslavement, culminating what we now know as a triangular trade. Raw materials moved from the colonies to the European metropoles. Manufactured goods go to Africa to buy slaves. Slaves are shipped to the colonies to work in plantations. Now, in the West Indian colonies, the goal was to produce agricultural commodities for a market, meaning that everything was done to maximize production. So traditional soil fertility and land management practices were completely neglected. So what happened is that you have planters doing nothing but monocropping on the same soil year in and year out. And of course, this was terrible for the soil. The West Indian colonies constantly complained about soil erosion. There were reports going back to Barbados as early as 1661, claiming that the soil is completely exhausted. A 1668 storm in Barbados washed up an entire church graveyard and carried all the coffins out to sea. There were reports from Antigua as early as in the late 1700s that reported that all the soils across all the West Indian colonies was completely decimated. As bad as they treated the soil, they treated the enslaved even worse. The average lifespan for an enslaved African on a Caribbean plantation was 7 years. Planters thought that it was more economically profitable to work a slave to death and import more than it was to actually pay for the upkeep of that slave. So all of this is to say that Europeans essentially robbed the soil. They robbed the nutrients from another place to support the growth of industry in the European metropoles. This illustrates two things. One, capitalism does not respect ecological boundaries. It will literally reconfigure entire biogeochemical cycles for profit. And two, it is wholly contingent on mass genocide and enslavement. Now, as important as nitrogen was to the growth of capitalism agriculturally, it was also critical to the ability of the state to wage war. Saltpeter or potassium nitrate is a key ingredient in gunpowder. Now, gunpowder has been around since 9th century China, but didn't become popular in Europe until the late Middle Ages. When armies really started to use saltpeter in bulk, they needed a reliable source. And so saltpeter is often formed through the degradation of organic matter under very dry conditions. So it was often found in places where organics accumulated, like dung heaps in farms or residential waste systems or dead bodies. Renaissance era England was so desperate for saltpeter, they commissioned saltpetermen, who under royal decree had the authority to go into anybody's home and search for saltpeter or to dig up corpses in church graveyards, which kind of pissed off the church. Saltpeter was so important to the state and their ability to wage war, colonize new territories, and subdue indigenous and African populations. It also led to new military innovations that led to the centralization of military power that ultimately created the modern nation state. Eventually, the demand for saltpeter grew so great that Europeans had to turn to foreign sources. And so this led to the British East India Company consolidating control over India. And that was able to support most of the nitrogen demands for saltpeter in Europe up until the late 19th century. Now, this is to show that, again, nitrogen has been critical to the development of mercantilism, right? But it's also been critical to the ability of the state to wage war to protect their mercantile interests. So now we're going to fast forward to 1840. This is the year that Justus von Liebig, a German chemist who is considered the father of modern agricultural science, popularized the idea of the limiting nutrient, right? And this theory basically says that plants are limited in growth by specific nutrients like nitrogen. So this is a good thing because now scientists have a really solid scientific understanding of what's limiting plant growth. But on the other side of this, agricultural capitalists realize that the more nutrients that they put into the soil, the more that they can take from the soil, right? This comes at a time when the British had adopted what was called hive farming, which was a precursor to modern agricultural practices that is characterized by high fertilizer inputs to grow grain to feed livestock for animal products. This also came at a time when the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. And so people were relocating from the countryside to the cities. These people still had to be fed. And so what happens is now you have a massive relocation of nutrients from the countryside to the cities. And then these nutrients ended up polluting surface waters in the form of industrial and human waste. But in order to power this relocation of nutrients, Europeans turned to imported fertilizers. And they started with Peruvian guano. Peru had rich deposits of seabird guano that became popular in Europe in the 1800s. And by 1840, Britain alone was importing over 100,000 tons per year. This trade was entirely contingent on the work of imported Chinese debt laborers who worked in basically slave-like conditions. The guano trade was so lucrative that the United States passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856, which said that any American citizen who finds an island that they think has guano on it has the right to claim that island for the United States. And this led to the claiming of over 100 different island and rock formations, 60 of which are still considered U.S. territories to this day. Now, once the guano deposits ran out, they turned to Chilean nitrates. Nitrates had accumulated in the Atacama Desert in Chile over millions of years. Shipments started as early as the 1830s and reached a peak in the late 19th century. Chilean nitrates were so important to the development of European industrial agriculture, as well as their ability to manufacture weapons. The United States used 50% of their Chilean nitrate imports to produce weapons. This trade was so important that Britain literally instigated a war between Chile on one side and Peru and Bolivia on the other, where Chile, financed by Britain, invaded, occupied, and eventually annexed territories that contained nitrate deposits. This is all to show that, again, the growth of industry in the global north was entirely contingent on ecological overdraft, or what scholars Richard York and Brett Clark call ecological imperialism, pulling resources from less developed countries. So this takes us up to the dawn of the 20th century. By this point, most of the United States and Europe is getting their nitrogen from Chilean nitrates. Chile is supplying 90% of the world's nitrogen. So it generates a sense of sort of acute scarcity, which is best encapsulated by this quote: "The fixation of nitrogen is vital to the progress of civilized humanity, and unless we can class it among the certainties to come, the great Caucasian race will cease to be foremost in the world and will be squeezed out of existence by races to whom wheaten bread is not the staff of life." I want to take a second to highlight this quote because there is a narrative in science that science is motivated by an altruistic desire to ensure that everybody has their basic needs met by technological interventions. And the reality is this has never been the case. Science has exclusively followed the interests of the elite, the property, and the privileged, and this inherently falls along racialized demarcations. Now, by this point, scientists had a really good understanding of natural nitrogen fixation that occurred through leguminous crops. So there was a hard ecological limit in terms of the amount of reactive nitrogen that was able to come into the environment. So the imperial powers of the global north sought to bypass this limit, and they did this, or they had attempted to do this for decades with the cyanamide process, Norwegian arc process, and byproduct ammonia recovery from coking. But none of these processes proved commercially viable. This is where Haber and Bosch come in. Haber is a German chemist with a background in electrochemistry. Bosch is a mechanical engineer that works for the German company BASF, which sponsors all this work. Haber builds an experimental apparatus that can synthesize ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen using a catalyst, and Bosch builds the industrial reactors that can withstand the high pressures and high temperatures needed to sustain their reaction. The key that I want to point out here, though, is BASF was competing with other German companies to be the first to come up with this technology and to monopolize it. Nobody in this process was motivated to solve global poverty or famine. Germany at the time was receiving most of its nitrates from Chilean nitrates, and right before World War I, they knew that if the war broke out, then the British could blockade them and cut off all their nitrates. So they emphatically pushed for and poured money into a scientific intervention that would be able to safeguard against that blockade. And so this led to the innovation that we see here with Haber and Bosch coming up with the Haber and Bosch process. But all of that to say is that, science does not follow the interests of the masses. It inherently follows the interests of the state, the interests of capital, and will bend to the will of both. So the same dynamics that existed when Haber and Bosch cracked the code on nitrogen fixation persist to this day. Even though we as humans have doubled the inputs of reactive nitrogen into the environment, the benefits from that are far from equitably distributed. In developed countries, most nitrogen fertilizer application goes to growing grain to feed livestock for animal products for export markets. In a lot of developing countries with low arable land and like high population densities like Indonesia, China, and India, nitrogen fertilizer application is literally a requirement to sustain their populations on mostly plant-based diets. This disparity is so extreme that the scholar Václav Smil estimates that the United States could probably feed its entire population with no nitrogen fertilizer application at all, albeit, we would all have to go vegetarians. But this disparity also exists in terms of nitrogen footprint. So if you think about the nitrogen footprint of a country, meaning all the emissions associated with the products that that country consumes instead of the local emissions, we see that a lot of developed countries are actually net nitrogen importers, meaning that a lot of the products that we consume, right, have very high emissions, but are manufactured in developing countries. And a lot of developing countries are net nitrogen exporters, right? And so this happens because most of the products that we consume are manufactured internationally, but we think that, as consumers, we don't have responsibility for those emissions. But in reality, all this shows is that capitalism is mobile, intractable, and can move across international borders to exploit people. So all that to say, if we want to be serious about nitrogen pollution, if we want to come up with engineering solutions to nitrogen pollution, we have to think very critically about the nature of the problem. We've been trained as engineers to think that you have a problem, you draw your control volume, you come up with an engineering solution to solve that problem, and then you apply it and neutralize the problem, right? But this is assuming that the nature of the problem is technical. And I hope that I've shown you that the problem of nitrogen pollution is not technical, it's inherently sociopolitical. So what we think looks like this actually looks more like this, where we have a problem, we use engineering to try and solve the problem, but because the problem is socio-political and not technical, it's a scalar mismatch, as a scholar Max LeBron would say, and all it does is reinforce the problem the structures that created the problem in the first place. I think I'm way over time here, so I am gonna jump right to the end. I did some science too. Y'all can Google me afterwards if you want. I want to give a huge shout out to my lab mates. Literally, I could not have done any of this without y'all. Like, y'all are literally my backbone and like have helped me through this entire process. And like, I have so much love for y'all and so much appreciation for y'all. I can't even put it into words. Shout out to my dissertation committee. Shout out to all the building staff. Shout out to all the administrators, all the people that show up to work every day and make sure we have a safe space to work in. Huge shout out to all y'all. Shout out to all my dogs from South Carolina. Shout out to all my dogs from Yale. I literally wish I could name all of y'all by name, but I don't have time to do that right now. Shout out to like all the friends that I have made here, especially the Black community. I'm president of Beaches. I've been in Beaches for 6 years. This has been an incredible community for me to pour into and to pour right back into me. Shout out to all the Black women that have held me down this entire time. I literally could not have done this without you. Shout out to my family. I ain't got no words. I ain't got no words for real. Just love, support, encouragement. Shout out to my aunt. My aunt is Inez. My middle name is Arnez. That's my namesake. Everything I do is try and live up to that name. Shout out to my pops. Shout out to all my brothers and sisters. Shout out to my moms. No words. Literally no words. And shout out to myself. My guy, listen, hey. Nah, my guy, Mike West, who just defended his PhD at MIT last week, inspired me to do this. Shout out to myself. Y'all see this perfect version of me up here, but what you don't see is all of the trials, the tribulations, all the failures. I could literally make a whole presentation just with my failures. Shout out to myself for getting through this, and that's it.